Let me go to the third part of my talk and focus on U.S.-Russian relations, which revolve these days mainly around the Ukraine war. Now, the conventional wisdom in the West is certainly true in the United States, certainly true in places like Poland, the Baltic states, and most of Western Europe. The conventional wisdom is that the Russians are bent on establishing hegemony in Europe. The argument is that the Russians, especially Vladimir Putin, are an imperial power, and that Vladimir Putin wants to either recreate the Soviet Union or he wants to create a greater Russia. And then, once that's done, he's going to push forward to create an empire in Eastern Europe. And the argument, as you know, is that he is determined, number one, to conquer Ukraine, number two, occupy Ukraine, and number three, make it part of a greater Russia. And then, when he's done with Ukraine, he'll march on toward other states, like Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, maybe Hungary, who knows? He's an imperialist. He's bent on regional hegemony, in effect. Right? This is the argument. And if you believe this story, it looks a lot like the China story, right? China, as I told you, there's no question that what China is trying to do is establish regional hegemony. The question is, do you think that's what the Russians are doing? I do not think that is true. I think it is dead wrong. First of all, it's very clear to me that there is no evidence, none, that Putin has ever said that he thought it would be a good idea to conquer Ukraine and make it part of Russia. There's no evidence that he ever said he thought it was feasible to do that. And there's no evidence that he ever said that that's what he plans to do. Nobody, and I've given this talk many times, I've corresponded with all sorts of people, I've had research assistants look into this. Nobody can show me where he said any one of those three things. Furthermore, Russia does not have the capability to conquer Ukraine, much less conquer other countries. And oh, by the way, there's no evidence he ever talked about conquering any other country. That's not surprising. If he didn't talk about conquering and integrating Ukraine into a greater Russia, he surely wasn't going to talk about doing that with the Baltic states or Poland. He never talked about that. There's no evidence of that. But again, he doesn't have the capability. You all have noticed that the Russians can barely defeat the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. How are these Russian forces going to conquer all of Ukraine? Have you ever looked at the number of troops that the Russians sent into Ukraine on February 24th? At the most, 190,000, at the most. You know, when the Germans went into Poland, September 1st, 1939, the Germans went in with 1.5 million troops. And by the way, in the middle of September, the Soviets came in the back door. The Germans, as a result of the von Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, understood full well that they wouldn't be conquering Poland alone. They'd be doing it with the Red Army. And Poland was not a formidable military state at the time. They still went in with 1.5 million troops. Putin went in with 190,000 troops at the most, and he didn't really have any reserves that could have been brought in afterwards. You're not going to conquer Ukraine with a force that size. Ukraine is a huge piece of territory, as you all surely understand. He wasn't interested in conquering Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. What was he doing? It's quite clear what he was doing. He was defending Russia against the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. We had a policy in the West, driven mainly by the United States, that had three prongs to it. One was NATO expansion, right? The goal was to bring Ukraine into NATO. The second prong was to bring Ukraine into the European Union. And the third prong was to foster an orange revolution in Ukraine and make it a pro-Western liberal democracy. These are the three prongs of the strategy. And the overall goal was, again, to create a Ukraine that was a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Now, NATO expansion was really the key. That's what really spooked the Russians. Of the three elements of the strategy, it was NATO expansion. It was, as many of you know, in April of 2008, at the Bucharest NATO summit, where NATO announced when the summit ended that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. Putin, who was actually at the summit, he was on friendly terms with the West at that point in time, went ballistic. The Russians made it unequivocally clear that Ukraine in NATO was categorically unacceptable. William Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, was then, 2008, the US ambassador in Moscow. He wrote a memorandum to Condoleezza Rice, who was then Secretary of State, warning against NATO expansion into Ukraine. He said that Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines for all members of the Russian foreign policy establishment, not just Putin. He said, I've talked to all the knuckle draggers in the recesses of the Kremlin, and I have talked to Putin's most ardent liberal opponents, and all of them agree Ukraine in NATO is unacceptable. Angela Merkel, who much to her credit opposed making any kind of offer to Ukraine in the April 2008 summit, said recently that the reason she opposed that idea was she understood it was the equivalent of a, these are her words, declaration of war against Russia. This is what Angela Merkel said. Nevertheless, the United States continued to push forward. We had gotten NATO expansion through for the first time in 1999. You all know this is when Hungary became a member of NATO, 1999. Then in 2004, we had the second expansion of NATO. Countries like Romania, the Baltic states, Slovenia came in to the alliance, right? And here we are, 2008. This is going to be the third big tranche. We're going to bring in Georgia, and we're going to bring in Ukraine. You remember what happened with Georgia. 4 months later, in August 2008, you had a war over Georgia. Surprise of surprises. The Russians were putting their foot down. Nevertheless, we continued to push. We continued to push. Why did we continue to push? The answer is Russia was weak. Think of the century of national humiliation for the Chinese. The Russians thought they could, the Americans thought they could shove another tranche of expansion to include Ukraine down Russia's throat. We thought the Russians were weak. And you know, when you're weak and the Americans got their gun sights on you, they're not good, right? So we continued to push, even after things blew up in Georgia in August 2008. And what was the end result? The end result is that in February 22nd, 2014, to be exact, the crisis in Ukraine broke out. And this is when the Russians took the Crimea, and trouble started in the Donbass, and you effectively got a civil war in the Donbass that the Russians were involved in. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, what did the Americans do in response? You might have thought that the Americans would have backed off, seeing the trouble that they had stirred up. But the Americans did not back off. NATO did not back off. In fact, we doubled down. We then started training large numbers of Ukrainian forces. We then started arming large numbers of Ukrainian forces. We were giving them intelligence, and we were helping them plan their military operations in the Donbass, in the civil war that was taking place in the Donbass. In effect, what was happening is that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. This is why in December 2021, this is last December, about 11 months ago, Putin and Lavrov made it very clear. They wrote a letter to the head of NATO, and they wrote a letter to President Biden saying, we want a written statement that says Ukraine will never become part of NATO. They had a number of other demands as well. The reason that happened was that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. And the American response was, we're not changing anything. Nothing is going to change. And the end result is on February 24th, Putin launched what was effectively a preventive war. Putin has decided that there are two possible outcomes here. One is a neutral Ukraine, which is what they preferred all along, or a Ukraine that is wrecked and is a rump state. And as you all know, what the Russians are now doing is they're wrecking Ukraine. This is a total disaster. It's absolutely horrible. I do not want to make light of it for 1 second. But the point is, this is the end result of our efforts, the West's efforts. And when I say the West, I'm talking mainly about the United States. The West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark. Russians found this intolerable. And by the way, I talked about the Monroe Doctrine. You all know the Monroe Doctrine. That's when we pushed all the European great powers out, and we said, you are not welcome in the Western Hemisphere. I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I can tell from looking at the crowd that there are a few other old dogs in the crowd, like me, who remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was all about the Monroe Doctrine. We did not, for 1 second, like the idea of the Soviet Union putting missiles in the Western Hemisphere, in Cuba, right near the United States. I want to ask you something. If China decided to form a military alliance with Canada or Mexico, and they put Chinese troops in Toronto or Montreal or in Mexico City, what do you think the United States would do? You think the United States would say, oh, that's not a big deal. We really don't care. I can guarantee you that would not be our response. We told Khrushchev in 1962, those missiles are going to go one way or another. We are not going to tolerate those missiles in the Western Hemisphere. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You're surprised that the Russians don't want a military alliance that was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union during the Cold War sitting on their doorstep? I don't understand why so many people in the West, especially in the United States and Western Europe, can't understand that this is one of the most provocative moves the United States could have ever pushed NATO to pursue. It's just hard to understand. We should understand it from our own historical experience. And again, Bill Burns said, and he was not the only one. You heard what Angela Merkel said. I could go back into the 1990s, tell you what George Kennan said. Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time when NATO expansion first got started. All sorts of people said, this is going to lead to no end of trouble. And you know what George Kennan said? Not only is it going to lead to no end of trouble, when the trouble comes, we're going to blame the Russians. And of course, that's exactly what happens. because we in the United States are never responsible for any of the world's problems. It's always somebody else.